When you first hear the term anti-fragility, it might not be immediately obvious what it actually means. It might sound like we're just talking about something that's not fragile, right? Something that's resistant to attacks, is somehow strong, but it actually means more than that. The Wikipedia article on anti-fragility says, anti-fragility is a property of systems that increase in capability, resilience, or robustness as a result of stressors, shocks, volatility, noise, mistakes, faults, attacks, or failures. Now, I would like to argue that Bitcoin is indeed, at least in some ways, anti-fragile, and that it's a reason to be extremely optimistic about the future of not just cryptocurrency and money, but because it has the potential to have such a large effect on the world, have an optimistic view on the world. So how has Bitcoin been attacked? Most people are aware of the idea of a 51% attack, which, at least as far as we know, has never occurred on Bitcoin. That's the thing where, okay, Bitcoin has a governance system that relies on hash power, but it makes the assumption that more than 50% of the hash power is quote-unquote honest, and honest may have not been the best word to pick, but what are you going to do? So with at least 50% of the hash power being honest, the Bitcoin system will follow the longest chain, and regardless of someone trying to, say, spend their coins twice, or somebody trying to rearrange the blocks so that they get payments back to themselves, overall, it will be not profitable for them to do so if they have left less than 50% of the hash power. So what does that leave? Well, Bitcoin isn't just some magical thing floating around in space that I'm saying like defends itself. No, Bitcoin is, in addition to being software, it is a social thing. It is an economic thing. It exists as the crossroads of a bunch of disciplines, and it means that people are involved. So if you're going to attack something where people are involved, and it's an ingeniously designed system that is extremely resistant to any attack that attacks it directly, say with hash power, which would be extremely expensive to do, and overt, you can't hide the fact that you're attacking something with hash power. What do you attack? Well, you attack the community, you attack the people. And that argument has already happened twice. So in August of last year, many people are aware that Bitcoin, the original Bitcoin, was one blockchain split into two main ones anyway. What is still currently referred to as Bitcoin, but sometimes we'll clarify that it's Bitcoin Core because the main repository and software that most people are running on that chain is called Bitcoin Core. That's the software. So some people have taken the liberty of referring to that chain as Bitcoin Core, which I think is reasonable because of the monopoly that Bitcoin Core has on the development of that chain. So what happened? Well, it split into Bitcoin Core, and then the other half was Bitcoin Cash. The split was a result of a many-year-long, what I would argue is an attack on Bitcoin via social means. The major communication channels over the internet, which is where most of the conversation about Bitcoin was occurring, were subjected to draconian levels of censorship. Now, this was some seriously messed up stuff, and if you don't know the specifics of it, I recommend just Googling the history of the Bitcoin scaling debate, because that's where you're going to get an article. I forget who it's by, but it's a good article. It lays out very chronologically how the censorship starts really kicking in, and how it seems like the moderation positions in those forums were acquired by people who did not have Bitcoin's best interest at heart. They began to use their moderation to silence dissenting opinions, but those dissenting opinions were the original Bitcoin opinions. The idea that it was a digital electronic cash, and the fact that the block size limit, not block size had been increasing since the very beginning because usage had been increasing since the very beginning. Usage, block size. But there was a limit, and the limit was put on to prevent a poison block attack. It was basically the fact that, especially early on when Bitcoin was worth next to nothing, miners have to store all the blocks. And if someone wanted to, without a block size limit, they could have just made their own transactions. That would have cost them nothing to make because they were going to mine the block, and they could have made a terabyte block. That, especially in 2009, that would have been a big problem. It would have made the barrier to entry to mining annoyingly high, given that there was no profit to be made, at least back then. So this 1 megabyte limit prevented someone from poisoning the network with a block that would just scare everybody away. And they'd be like, well, I don't want to be a part of this cool, nifty new thing if it means someone's just going to dump a terabyte of data on my hard drive, and because they have the hash power, I have to follow them. The usage of Bitcoin at the time was hundreds of times beneath that. It wasn't even close to 1 megabyte. And so usage slowly increased as Bitcoin got more and more popular, and then it started approaching 1 megabyte. Now, what happens when you have a limit on something like that is that if you reach the limit, you end up imposing a fee market, because Bitcoin, you can attach a fee which goes to the miner, right? And while a fee market as a general idea is not necessarily a bad thing, an artificially imposed fee market is a terrible idea, because there are market mechanisms that could much more efficiently determine what the block sizes we should accept are. And in fact, I'm sure some people would argue that there should be no block size limit, and that it should be determined on a per block basis whether or not this block is indeed an actual poison block that should be rejected or not. But we got close to that 1 megabyte limit, and everyone's like, all right, well, it's time to increase the limit, right? And not only was the usage approaching that limit, but it had been many years since the limit was put in place, and technology had progressed not just, substantially, I mean, a whole heck of a lot. I mean, how much is 1 megabyte now? It's nothing. So just doubling it to 2 megabytes probably would have set us up for a good deal of time. But there were all of a sudden some developers that were saying, oh, no, I think that's a bad idea. I think fee markets are good. They argued that increasing the block size limit would increase the demands on miner hardware, and therefore would be a centralization pressure, which was laughable, because while centralization pressure is a real thing to talk about in Bitcoin, the storage requirements are on the priority list way down there. Electricity cost, hardware cost, these are the real centralizing factors today in Bitcoin. And maybe when Bitcoin is a worldwide currency and there are billions of transactions flowing in every day, then we might have to worry about storage space. But also might not have to, because if our ability to store data increases faster than the rate at which transactions are increasing in frequency, then we don't have to worry about anything. They argued that hard forks are bad and soft forks are good, which is beyond the scope of this video, but it's worth pointing out two things. One, the terminology around hard forks and soft forks is ambiguous and not well defined. And there are people that argue that the general idea of a hard fork is actually preferable to a soft fork, whereas they were just arguing the opposite. So it was not some settled thing that hard forks are scary and bad and kick off old people from the network, and that's really important because you need a lot of full nodes running. You don't need full nodes running. You need economically relevant nodes running, because anyone else follows. Now, it's something you can do if you want to, but it's not necessary to the system. And it's certainly not worth prioritizing making sure that everyone can follow the blockchain when there's no benefit to the system to do that. There's benefit to the people, sure, but why would you prioritize hobbyists that want to have a copy of the blockchain over the capability of the system? It's just ridiculous. So all these ideas started getting pushed on the forums, and anyone who disagreed would be censored or banned. And these things happened in pretty messed up ways. So there was something called shadow banning, where they would make it so that you wouldn't know that your posts were invisible. If you were logged in, you'd go to where you replied or commented or even made a whole post, and you would see it. It would be there. But if you logged out and looked for it, it would not be there. And that would be the case for everybody else too. They would not see your post. You would just think you're not getting replied to, that you're getting ignored. People were banned just for posting quotes from the white paper, Satoshi Nakamoto quotes that very directly contradicted the narrative that was being pushed on these censored forums. They were banned for posting that. So they're being incredibly unreasonable and also obviously and blatantly dishonest about their complaints. So the reasons they give for banning, they'll quote out of context, all the standard fallacies that you would use to try to discredit somebody to someone else who's not willing to actually do the research. So things like that happened. And it wasn't just like, oh, just me and a couple other people got banned. No, tons of people got banned from our Bitcoin. Now, some of them got banned for things that still weren't worth banning for, but maybe they were being unreasonable too. But that's kind of the whole point of free speech, right? You have a right to be unreasonable. You have a right to be wrong. It's just, what are you going to do? You can't differentiate between someone purposely trying to disrupt the conversation, which you could argue is a bannable offense. If you're only there to disrupt, you should be banned. But how can you determine that? You can't. There's no way. You can say this person is either a total idiot who also just happens to have zero tact and be abrasive, or they're a shill, a troll, whatever. The fact that you can't tell the difference means the only way you can deal with it is to allow it, let Reddit, which is the platform, we're all on this platform, Reddit, right? We sort of subscribe to it by signing up and deciding to participate there. We have to let the system work as best it can, which is with upvotes and downvotes. Now, there's a problem with that, which is that it can be easily Sybil attacked. This idea that you can fake identities very easily on the internet. You can make 20 accounts on Reddit. It doesn't matter. You can buy Reddit accounts. You can buy old Reddit accounts that look super legit. You can hire companies to help sway public opinion via their fake accounts on the internet. And all of this is almost definitely happening. Now, can I be 100% sure it's happening? No, because like I just said, I can't be sure that everyone that's being unreasonable and abrasive are actually these people that are being paid to do so. But given the existence of a market for those things, and given the money to be made by slowing progress in Bitcoin's development, it's almost definitely happening. I would say 99.999% sure. Given that, okay, so these things exist. There are people out there that whose job it is to sway public opinion using sort of a set of standard ways that you can almost abuse the human psychology. And there's tons of money that stands to benefit behind it. And that's really all you need. If there's profit to be made, someone's doing it, or someone's trying to do it, or someone's going to do it. That's almost certainly the case on our Bitcoin. The censorship really kicked in and managed to probably convince a lot of people, because if you're not super informed, if you're not reading every day and thinking critically, I mean really critically, I mean there's stuff that sounds reasonable at first. That argument about 1 megabyte centralizing mining pressure, that's totally potentially a legitimate concern. Oh yeah, more burden on a miner means less people can do it. This is a decentralized system. We want it to remain decentralized. Yeah, we need to keep the block size small. But that just falls apart when you and I hate to say actually think about it, because I'm sure some people do think about it and really think they've arrived at the correct conclusion. But in the context of other centralization pressures and all sorts of just other ways that you can look at these things, you realize, oh no, that's actually totally bogus. It's just mildly clever. And it's not even that clever. It's just mildly clever, and with censorship on your side, you can sway the narrative remarkably effectively. So, this censorship, this blatant hijacking of the Bitcoin community was the attack, right? So what happened? Did everyone just go home and be like, well, crap, I guess, someone took over Bitcoin? No, absolutely not. They started a new subreddit called RBTC with different moderators and started talking about Bitcoin there, and how the block size limit desperately needs to go up so that we don't end up with a catastrophe where there's a huge backlog of transactions. So what does that mean? That means that you have to attach a higher fee to your transaction to get a miner to mine it. And that means Bitcoin becomes expensive. I mean, Bitcoin was effectively free to use early on. And even now on Bitcoin Cash, fees are less than 1/10 of a cent. 1 Satoshi per byte will get you into the next block, the vast majority of the time. Someone could mine an empty block if they wanted, but then the next block comes along, and what do you know? They can fill it up. They can fill it up with all the transactions. And so while right now, that's not a huge amount of money, the 1/10 of a cent per transaction, if someone skips out on that, they're not missing out on much, because the block reward is substantially more than the fees included in the block. But in the future, that will not be the case. Eventually, the block reward will diminish, and by then, we will need to have reached transaction volumes that allow the miners to be rewarded enough to incentivize them to continue mining and secure the system. And so for that to happen, with low fees, we need an enormous transaction volume. But not that big when you think about it. When you think of all the transactions that are going on every day on PayPal and Visa and MasterCard, it's really not that much. We could do it by replacing them, no problem, with 1/10 of a cent fees per transaction. And of course, I shouldn't be talking about per transaction. I should be talking about Satoshis per byte, because Bitcoin transactions are priced by their size, because that's how much space it's going to take up, both in the block, which shouldn't be super relevant unless we are actually nearing the technological limits of storing and propagating blocks. That's really the bigger issue, is the ability to propagate, validate the blocks that we're sending around, and make sure we don't get orphaned. Because if you publish a huge block, it's going to take forever to get around to everybody else, and in that time, someone else might actually find a block that propagates faster than yours if they're willing to mine a smaller block. So that, like I said earlier, that's a natural way for a block size to be arrived at. If we really are at the point where we're reaching the technological limits, it will naturally limit itself because the participants in the network will not want to lose money. And so if they say, I've got this 32 megabyte block, but there's a good chance, or not even a good chance, but a good enough chance that I'll be orphaned, I'm only going to include so many of the transactions. That's arguably the way it should be. Now, optimizations will make numbers like 32 megabytes, 20 megabytes sound like nothing in a couple years. It already is the case. The Gigablock initiative was able to propagate a gigabyte block. Now, that was not sustained throughput, at least if my memory is correct. But, I mean, that just dwarfs the stuff we've got going on right now. And it's what's in store in the future. Okay, so Bitcoin was attacked. That's where we're going with this, right? So the attack involved the narrative shifting, the censorship, the personal attacks, like, oh, Roger Ver is a convicted felon and a known scammer. Go on any other forum and everyone says that because the narrative was pushed so hard and so effectively that it wasn't just an attack, it was a successful attack to some degree, at least socially. Everyone, and by everyone, I mean at least some of the most vocal people, will say, yeah, of course, Roger Ver is a known scammer and a convicted felon and he shouldn't be trusted. He's just in it for himself. Whereas if you watch any videos where he actually talks about Bitcoin, you realize he's as close as you can get to an idealist who sticks to his guns just all the time. I mean, his message hasn't changed even the tiniest bit since he started. He said, economic freedom for the world makes the world a better place, and I think Bitcoin increases economic freedom, and so therefore I support Bitcoin and I promote it full time. He's just been saying that for years and years and years. Nothing has changed. What changed was the narrative being spun by people online. So people split off into their own community, and then what happened? Well, finally, after trying to sort of from the inside of this already censored and broken community convince people that no, actually a block size limit increase is a good idea, well, that's not going to happen, it looks like. And the current developers were about to implement SegWit, which is a whole other talk about how it, arguably anyway, shifts the incentives of mining and doesn't solve the scaling problem, even though they argued it would. All these just terrible ideas that they're trying to pile into Bitcoin to make it totally useless, or at least arguably, right? Maybe some of the developers really do think it's a good idea, but I find that unlikely. It seems more likely that the attack was to get control of the forums, get control of the main repo, the main GitHub repo for Bitcoin Core, which was the client that almost everybody was running. There were alternatives, but because almost everybody was running Bitcoin Core, if anyone else changed anything, it would have no effect because anyone running that software would fork themselves off of the network. Unless you have significant hash power running your software, it's pretty much pointless. So people were like, no, we need to get these pull requests into Bitcoin Core because it's important to change what people are actually running. Now, SegWit was finally going to go through, and a lot of people thought it was a terrible idea. So a set of developers who are now Bitcoin ABC decided, no, we're going to fork the code, which means we're going to split it. We're going to take the exact same code and then change it and say, all right, anyone who wants to run this code can run it, but we're also going to implement replay protection, which on a more fundamental level makes the split of the chain, instead of two sort of fuzzy differences between the same transactions occurring, makes it a totally separate coin, other than the fact that they're secured by the same proof of work. And so proof of work, the miners can switch between the chains totally seamlessly. And in that sense, they're unified. You could argue it's actually just a long-term split of the coin that has yet to reach Nakamoto consensus. And that's what I would argue is the case. I think either BTC or BCH will eventually go to zero. And I would argue it's going to be BTC. But other people would argue that it's going to be BCH, whatever, it doesn't really matter. The point is that developers forked the code and created their own coin. But, of course, because it was rejecting SegWit, which many people argue was a terrible idea, and implemented a block size increase that was extremely reasonable. I think it was to 8 megabytes, which was 8 times the current limit, and also was still well within the technical capabilities of current hardware, not even just professional hardware, but home hardware, well within the capabilities, and internet connections and internet speed and all that stuff. Very safe. They forked the code, and now one of them is arguably the real Bitcoin that has what? What did it do? Did it just keep existing? No, it actually changed. In order to fight the attack that was happening, they made it better. They said, we have things we want to make better about Bitcoin. They're not letting us do it, so we're just going to do it anyway, because it's a permissionless space. You don't need anyone's permission to write code and release it to people and say, hey, you want to run this code? And in fact, that's what people tried to do early on before Bitcoin split. Bitcoin XT were this code that given a certain scenario will switch to allowing larger blocks if enough people are running it, which was extremely reasonable. It would have been probably more bold even to say, like, no, we're just going to start allowing blocks at some given time and we'll fork off the network if we need to. But that's not even what they did. They said, we're even waiting for consensus, quote unquote consensus, right? And so that was released and of course got totally trashed, and it was actually talking about it was a bannable offense. This was an upgrade to Bitcoin. It wasn't even Bitcoin Cash yet. It wasn't this idea of a separate coin. It was the idea of, no, we need to upgrade the network and whoever runs it can run it and we'll see if it reaches those levels. Even that was considered a bannable offense because they said that's not Bitcoin. If you get a block size higher than 1 megabyte, if you do a hard fork, it's no longer Bitcoin because consensus was never reached. Consensus being their definition of consensus with the developers who they're listening to, which is a totally arbitrary metric, but it was made a bannable offense. So it's not surprising that it was eventually required that people fork and create Bitcoin Cash. But of course, you could argue that they didn't create Bitcoin Cash. They just upgraded Bitcoin. That's all they did. They upgraded Bitcoin. People kept running it. And then because of the social environment, they were forced to pick a new name and to start from scratch with replay protection. Because with replay protection, what that means is that people need to do something actively to access their coins on your side of the split. Whereas without that, they don't. In fact, the sides between the splits are pretty fuzzy when you don't do replay protection, because that means that coins you send on one side of the split, even if you try to only send them on one side, are valid. The transaction you broadcast is valid on the other side. So someone could replay that transaction to the other side, and then you're just sending both coins on both chains. But that's kind of a funny way to say it when you realize that they're kind of just the same thing and two different versions of it, and we haven't decided which one's the right one yet. So you could argue instead that instead of sending two coins on two chains, what you're doing is sending the same coins on two chains. So we upgraded Bitcoin and then built up a new community around it. Now, was the community smaller? Yeah, absolutely, because the other one got totally taken over. It's the major one, and it had a lot of ways to go. But it was better. Because when they split off, they had the opportunity to start over. Not only could they just say, oh, we're splitting off, they had the opportunity to fix things that wouldn't have gotten fixed otherwise. So what is this all leading up to? This idea of anti-fragility. It wasn't just like, oh, Bitcoin was resistant to attack. No, and arguably Bitcoin was vulnerable to attack, but in being attacked, got stronger, or at least the piece of it that was forced to split off to remain the true Bitcoin got stronger. It got better. It was given the opportunity to be better because it was attacked. That's a remarkable thing, and I would argue at least that there are not many other situations where that clearly a benefit to be attacked that way. So the split happened. Of course, Bitcoin Cash was trashed on the censored forums, and it was a scam fork. Roger Ver owns Bitcoin Cash. He started it, and all this bull floating around. But it didn't matter because we had a functioning version of Bitcoin the way it was supposed to be, and we could start again. We could say this is the real Bitcoin, and all the work we did educating people about Bitcoin would not have to necessarily be redone, but it would have to be, refocused. We'd have to say, remember all that stuff we were saying about Bitcoin? It's still true. It's still true about the real Bitcoin. It just so happens that now the real Bitcoin is Bitcoin Cash. And that happened for unfortunate reasons. But what are we going to do? That's where we are. And if we want to increase economic freedom for the whole world, channeling Roger Ver right now, then what do? We just say, okay, this is the new Bitcoin, which is really the old Bitcoin. It's the real Bitcoin. It's the way Bitcoin is supposed to be. And we go forward from there. Just recently now, Bitcoin was arguably attacked again. You don't have to follow the whole Craig Wright bull drama to appreciate the fact that another takeover attempt occurred and arguably failed. And this one's kind of interesting because they couldn't do it primarily socially because the forums were no longer censored, or they couldn't gain control of them. So this new attack required also hash power. The whole Craig Wright thing, it's interesting not because Craig Wright is interesting, but because of the effect it had on and the ability it had to convince people that he might be Satoshi, and if he is Satoshi, he's probably super deep. I mean, like deeper than we could possibly imagine. And then he starts spewing. I mean, just spewing and spewing and spewing pseudo profound bullshit. I mean, if you try to read the theory of the nature of the firm or whatever it is, I mean, it's almost unreadable. It's the spewing of attempts at jargon that mean nothing, but to somebody who already has the idea plan in their head, maybe this guy is Satoshi. If he is, holy crap, this could be crazy stuff that I just don't get. And maybe it's not. Maybe they'd even be able to admit, yeah, it's not written well, but he's saying something here, right? The answer is almost definitely not. There is so little being said, and it's come out now that many of his papers had sections blatantly plagiarized from other sources. I mean, it's a real mess. But what was he able to do? He was able to convince some subsection of the community that he might know what he's talking about, right? And that's enough to, even if you don't have a ton of like paid shills on your payroll or whatever, which might have also been the case, but we can't know for sure, right? We can only say this person's being unreasonable or reasonable, and we can't possibly know whether they're being paid to be unreasonable or whether they've just been convinced to be unreasonable. But either way, that ended up with a ton of Craig Wright fanatics. I mean, really, like it's become an effective cult, and I'm not really even sure how many real people are in it. I'm really not. Even some of the more prominent figures like Ryan X. Charles or Unwriter, who have come out in support of the Craig Wright side of this most recent fork, which occurred on Bitcoin Cash, I'm not entirely convinced that they're not purely paid to be doing what they're doing. You know, now I don't want to imply that I'm sure that they're just being paid to do what they're doing. I can't know. That's sort of what I've been trying to stress this whole time, is this idea that it's impossible to tell the difference. You can only say if someone's been unreasonable. And Ryan X. Charles, slowly as they approach the time of this most recent upgrade, which is in every 6 months, Bitcoin Cash has a scheduled upgrade. He became more and more unreasonable and started using fallacious arguments in support of Craig Wright being Satoshi. Prove he's not Satoshi. What? His products started kind of going to shit. Yours.org, the development momentum was non-existent. They stopped allowing new registrations, and they argue it's because of combating spam and stuff, and they were busy working on Money Button, which looked really cool. How much of that is sort of an embrace, extend, extinguish sort of plan? If we create, or even just fund and then convince, you don't have to. Ryan X. Charles doesn't have to be a paid shill to be part of the embrace, extend, extinguish plan, which could potentially be, let's create some cool stuff, right? And then stop. Just stop. Stop making it cool. And then everyone else who had thought to make a yours.org would say, well, yours.org already exists. I'll do something else maybe eventually, I guess. And anyone else who's thinking to make a money button would be like, well, they're already making a money button, so I guess I'll work on something else eventually, I guess. And then what happens? After months and months of yours being totally stalled and all this work being done on Money Button, he did what seemed like a complete 180, not necessarily in his views, but in the reasonableness, in his ability to reason, or at least his apparent ability to reason. Maybe his ability to reason wasn't actually affected and he was a paid shill the whole time, but also maybe his ability to reason was severely compromised by incentives kind of being in the wrong place, where he'd received a lot of money, funding money, from nChain, the company that Craig Wright is the chief scientist there. And one could argue that the whole existence of the company was based on the idea that Craig Wright would reveal that he's Satoshi, and then they would just get support. Bam! You've got people who will follow you no matter what because you've convinced them that Craig Wright is Satoshi. So this next attack that happened was a social and hash power attack, because they had acquired a legitimately significant amount of hash power. Or maybe not, maybe it was all rented, but at the very least they had money. They were willing to throw money at it, and not just by potentially hiring people to go and change the narrative. They're saying, no, we think, hash power is all that matters. Bitcoin is only hash power. The economic and social aspects are totally irrelevant, and it's just a hash power thing, and we're going to win, and we're going to starve the other chain, and we're going to have the most proof of work, and anyone who wants to transact on the other side of the chain is going to be severely disappointed because we're going to reorg their chain. Now, of course, it turns out a lot of those threats were empty, but they did accumulate a significant amount of hash power, at least for a short amount of time. And so what happened then? The social attack arguably failed. Most people in RBTC, especially after having gone through the bull of our Bitcoin, most people came around to the realization that any, notions they'd had about Craig Wright being good for the community, whether or not he was Satoshi, which You don't have to argue that point at all to point out that Craig Wright is an absolutely terrible, awful, the worst thing for the community and for progress. Just the things he stands for and the points he argues are, and his total lack of technical knowledge. Absolutely everything else that he's argued has been absolutely awful. His support of intellectual property use in these open source systems, and his willingness to use government enforced monopolies, which is what patents are by at least any reasonable definition, given my not so humble opinion. So we got attacked again. And what happened? So there was this threat of reorganization, right? So what happened? Did we just say, like, well, we're just going to keep mining and hope we don't get reorged? No, absolutely not. People are like, well, what if he's not bluffing? What if this is the one time that Craig Wright actually follows through with anything he says? You know, he didn't end up banging out 30 patents a day, and he didn't write a paper a week. But he apparently has some money. And people would argue that it's probably mostly funding from Calvin Ayre. That's not really relevant. So what did people do? They ended up having to think about what would allow someone to defend against a reorg attack. Well, they added a checkpoint. And then they also put in what, at least given my impression, was a temporary measure to prevent reorgs longer than 10 blocks. A block comes on average every 10 minutes. So that'd be like 100 minutes. They're saying, nope, we're just going to say if someone tries to introduce, they say, we have more proof of work than you do on this chain that you just happen to have not seen happen, as in like they weren't hiding it or something, but they almost definitely would have been at that point if you're 10 blocks behind. We're just going to say, no, we're not going to follow it. We're going to follow this chain. And you can continue mining your longer proof of work chain, but we're defining you as a dishonest miner that is attacking the system, and so we're going to just ignore your chain. It's like, well, Bitcoin was built on proof of work. Well, Bitcoin was built to use proof of work as a consensus mechanism that assumes 50% or greater honest hash power. And given that Bitcoin is a social and economic thing that needs to keep working, it's not unreasonable that they said, well, that would not be an unreasonable assumption to say that somebody has been dishonest with their hash power by not revealing the blocks they're mining to everyone else and waiting 10 blocks to reveal their longer chain so as to disrupt everything. Well, seeing as that's an attack, we're just not going to accept it. And people got all up in arms about, oh, you're changing the incentives, and it arguably might, not allowing a 10-block reorg could make it hard for someone just entering the system to say which is the correct chain. Well, this one's got more proof of work, and that's kind of the only thing we've got to go by, right? And so now there are conversations about more reasonable algorithms talking about how much more proof of work you would need to reorg a chain. So instead of just needing more proof of work, what if what if someone reorgs 2 blocks? What if for that you actually need, instead of just 50% of the hash power, what if you need like 75% of the hash power? And what if you want to do 3 blocks, you need 87% of the hash power? And then some logarithmic or exponential or way of correlating how much you need versus what you're allowed to do. And so it forced people to think about that and implement them. So what did that do? It made Bitcoin stronger. That's incredible. When we were attacked, Bitcoin, which is the convergence of all these things, got stronger. Bitcoin being the combination of the open sourceness of the code and the community and people's willingness to run software made Bitcoin stronger. What prompted me to talk about this was I was talking to someone recently about Bitcoin and how it has all the potential to do just affect so much positive change in the world. I mean, it's incredible how much just the idea of Bitcoin has the potential to change. I mean, okay, so money is a huge thing, right? Just the idea of value and trade, and how arguably the largest evils committed in the world, large-scale war, are funded via the control of the money supply. Give me control of a nation's money supply and I care not about its laws, right? So arguably some of the biggest evils being committed would be impossible if the entire world were using Bitcoin instead, where you couldn't inflate the money supply and effectively steal from your citizens by printing money that you didn't earn in the first place and being able to be the first that spends it before the deflation actually takes effect. Because, of course, the demand for a currency only drops once the extra currency enters the system. So the first person to spend it, it's free money. For everyone else, their money that they're currently holding becomes worth less. So all this good, and that's just like the first part. Then once you have this decentralized peer-to-peer electronic cash that functions on a distributed timestamp server, which is what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is just a distributed timestamp server, or with proof of work invested to validate it, and the proof of work is incentivized by a reward via the cash system. So you can't have a distributed timestamp server that has all these cool things available to it without it being the basis for an electronic cash system. But once you have that, you have a distributed timestamp server that you can use to do a lot of really cool distributed things. So I was getting really excited about this, and the pessimist in the person that I was talking to was like, but if it has that potential and it would get in the way of so many powerful people's profit models, people are just going to ruin it, aren't they? Like, are they just, people always ruin everything, you know? Then I realized, well, like, oh, wait. I mean, yes, you're totally right, but they've already done that. And what has it done? It's made Bitcoin stronger. They've tried to ruin it and arguably actually sort of succeeded in ruining it. They destroyed Bitcoin and forced Bitcoin to become something else and be stronger. Bitcoin really is anti-fragile. And as long as there are people who are willing to fork the code and compete and say, this is the code we've got, and we think you should run it, and let people decide whether they run it, I think Bitcoin will remain anti-fragile. Coins on two chains. Two chains. Oh, man. This is long. Oh my god. Oh. And we'll talk about Bitcoin?